Imagine waking up on a Tuesday, checking your phone, and realizing the price of gas just jumped by like 50% overnight.
Oh, easily.
Right. And you turn on the news and global shipping has essentially just frozen in place.
Typically paralyzed.
Exactly. And then you look out your window or maybe you check social media and millions of Americans are shutting down major cities in these unprecedented protests.
It sounds like a dystopian movie trailer, honestly.
It really does. But according to this highly controversial, incredibly detailed new dispatch we are unpacking today, we are exactly 50 days into that precise reality.
Yeah.
Welcome to the deep dive. The date is Sunday, April 19th, 2026, and the entire world is watching a massively disruptive geopolitical earthquake unfold.
It is, it's a landscape defined by absolute chaos right now. And trying to navigate it in real time is incredibly difficult.
Almost impossible.
Right. We're looking at an event where the dust hasn't even begun to settle, which makes our source material today so vital to analyze. We're examining a very specific, singular document. It's this staggering, granular timeline from a blog called Barackface.
Yes, the Barackface dispatch.
Exactly. The author of this dispatch, who, by the way, claims to have been Barack Obama's first full-time volunteer in New York City, has published a piece titled 50 Days of Operation Epic Fury.
And our mission today is to take this document, which outlines what it calls the 2026 Iran war, or, the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran, and just break it down to its studs.
Right.
We are going to map out the military chain reactions, the global economic shockwaves, and the severe political dominoes that this author claims have fallen over the last 50 days.
But before we go a single step further, we really need to establish a very firm boundary for you, the listener.
Absolutely. This is crucial.
The material we are dissecting today covers a highly politically charged, violent, and ongoing fictionalized scenario set in 2026. We are functioning strictly as your guides to parse the claims, the statistics, and the strategic analysis presented by the author of this specific blog post.
We are absolutely not taking a political stance here.
No, not at all.
We are not endorsing or condemning the actions of the United States, Israel, Iran, Donald Trump, or the millions of protesters mentioned in the text. Our sole job is to read the map that this Barackface blog has drawn.
Right. We just want to help you make sense of the internal logic of this document, to understand the how and the why behind the staggering events it describes.
Exactly. Our focus is on the mechanisms of the conflict as the author presents them. Like, how does a massive military strike trigger a global economic crisis?
Or how do domestic politics suddenly influence foreign battlefields? We are just unpacking the narrative architecture of the dispatch.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's jump straight into the catalyst. According to the timeline mapped out here, the spark that ignites this entire powder keg happens on February 27th, 2026.
Right, and the context the author provides for that date is the complete collapse of the 2025 and 2026 nuclear negotiations. Diplomacy had basically hit a brick wall.
So, total diplomatic failure.
Yeah. The dispatch frames that diplomatic collapse as the necessary prelude. The actual threshold is crossed when President Donald Trump, operating from Air Force One, officially orders what the blog dubs Operation Epic Fury.
Okay.
And the sheer scale of the initial assault, which the source says begins the following day on February 28 at roughly 9:45 in the morning Iran time, is designed to be overwhelming.
How overwhelming are we talking?
The blog cites nearly 900 individual strikes in just the first 12 hours.
Oh, wow. I want to pause on that number. 900 strikes in half a day.
Yeah, it's massive.
That isn't a targeted surgical operation. I mean, that's a kinetic avalanche. It's an overwhelming, localized bombardment intended to shatter an entire national infrastructure in a single morning.
Right. And the author lists targets spanning roughly 20 separate Iranian provinces.
20 provinces.
Yes. They are hitting missile silos, air defense grids, command and control centers, and these heavily fortified leadership compounds. They even specifically note that the Natanz nuclear facility suffered severe damage.
The terminology the source uses to describe this, they call it a synchronized decapitation strike.
Yeah, and understanding the mechanism of that is really crucial. This wasn't just dropping bombs. It was a highly complex, multi-layered choreography. The author says it involved U.S. B-2 stealth bombers, long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles, unmanned drones, and Israeli fighter jets all hitting at once.
A decapitation strike, by definition, is designed to cut the head off the snake, right?
Exactly.
And according to the blog, in terms of its immediate lethal objective, it succeeded.
It did.
The text states, the initial wave killed Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, members of his immediate family, and the top echelon of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
And we should probably define the IRGC here, because it is vital to understanding the rest of the dispatch.
Yeah, go ahead.
The IRGC is not just a traditional army. It is a massive, deeply entrenched paramilitary force that essentially functions as a parallel state in Iran.
Right, they have their hands in everything.
Exactly. They control vast swaths of the Iranian economy, internal security, and fundamentally, they manage Iran's foreign proxy networks across the Middle East.
So eliminating their top commanders is an attempt to basically sever the central nervous system of Iran's entire regional strategy.
That's the logic the author presents, yes.
But that brings up a massive strategic contradiction that I see in this text.
Yeah.
You look at an operation of this magnitude, dropping the absolute top tier of a nation's leadership and its most powerful generals in a matter of hours. The theory is that if you take out the leadership, you paralyze the adversary. You cut the brain off from the body, and the body dies.
That's a shock and awe theory, yeah.
But the author explicitly describes this as a fluid and ongoing conflict over the next 50 days. So I have to push back on the premise here. If you take out the leadership, doesn't it just empower the decentralized hardline guys on the ground?
It's a great question.
Like, does a decapitation strike actually sever the head of the snake, or does it just trigger an automatic decentralized reflex?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the author's narrative actually leans heavily into your skepticism. The strategic intent of shock and awe is indeed paralysis. But the source strongly hints that this Iranian reflex you mentioned was deeply baked into their military doctrine.
Oh, so they planned for it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When you are a state that has anticipated a massive decapitation strike for decades, you don't build a military architecture that requires the supreme leader to individually approve every single counterattack.
Yeah, makes sense.
You build a decentralized, fail-deadly system. The fact that the U.S. and Israel targeted 20 provinces simultaneously shows they knew they were dealing with a massive, distributed military apparatus.
So it's less like cutting the head off a snake and more like striking a massive beehive with a baseball bat.
That's a good way to put it.
You might instantly obliterate the queen, but the swarm is still there, it's furious, and it already knows exactly what its job is.
Right.
And to really grasp the disconnect between the theory of the strike and its reality, the blog contrasts the political rhetoric used to justify the war with an immediate, horrific event on the ground.
Yeah, the justifications the author records are stark. President Trump, addressing the nation and posting on Truth Social, framed the entire operation through the lens of self-defense. The source notes he explicitly invoked UN Article 51.
And we should clarify Article 51 for you, the listener. That is the article in the United Nations Charter that recognizes a nation's inherent right to self-defense if an armed attack occurs. But invoking it for a preemptive strike, like attacking before you are physically attacked because you believe a threat is imminent, is historically one of the most hotly contested areas of international law.
Absolutely. And the language the source quotes from the U.S. administration is incredibly maximalist. The stated goals were to raise the Iranian missile program, annihilate their navy, and fundamentally degrade the axis of resistance.
Annihilate and raise. That's heavy rhetoric.
Very. But crucially, the author notes that Trump also framed this as a once-in-a-generation opportunity for the Iranian people to overthrow their regime.
Ah, the regime change angle.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's statements, according to the blog, mirrored this. He cited the removal of existential threats while simultaneously expressing support for the freedom of the Iranian populace.
Okay, so the rhetoric is this potent mix of clinical military annihilation, racing eyes destroying, coupled with the language of liberation and freedom. But then the dispatch forces us to look at the immediate cost of that kinetic avalanche. During the first 48 hours, according to the text, a U.S. Tomahawk missile strikes the Shajara Tayyip Girls Elementary School.
And the author notes a critical geographical detail here. The school was located adjacent to a naval base in the city of Manab.
And the outcome is catastrophic. The blog reports approximately 170 civilians are killed, specifically emphasizing that the majority were children.
It's devastating.
Iran immediately declares it a deliberate war crime. The U.S. military says it is investigating the incident as collateral damage. The United Nations Human Rights Chief, Volker Turk, is quoted condemning the reckless impact on civilian life.
Right.
And the author paints a picture of Tehran in the aftermath, not as a city rising up in liberation, but as a ghost town paralyzed by profound national mourning.
This specific incident in Manab highlights the brutal reality of modern asymmetric warfare that the source is trying to convey. The term collateral damage attempts to sanitize a horrific outcome, but it occurs precisely because of how military infrastructure is embedded.
Yeah, they mix the targets with the civilians.
Exactly. When an adversary places a high-value naval base in a dense urban environment right next to a school, the mathematical probability of a catastrophic civilian toll during a mass bombardment skyrockets, regardless of the precision of a Tomahawk missile.
I hear the tactical explanation, I really do, but I have a really hard time believing a single school bombing, as tragic as it is, entirely derails a national liberation movement.
Why is that?
Well, historically, collateral damage happens in every major conflict. Populations know their governments put military bases near cities. So if the stated goal of the U.S. and Israel was to free the Iranian people and trigger a regime change from within, how does a mass civilian casualty event in the first 48 hours impact that objective? Why does the author claim this unified the country?
What's fascinating here is that it's not just about the single event. It's about the psychological catalyst it provides for a society that's already under immense pressure. The author's logic suggests that external bombardment, especially when it results in highly visible, visceral tragedies involving children, almost universally triggers a rally around the flag effect.
Even if they hate their own government.
Yes, according to the source. Even in a society deeply fractured and historically resentful of its own autocratic regime, the immediate trauma of foreign missiles dropping on schools supersedes internal political grievances. The grief becomes a unifying force.
It weaponizes the mourning. The grief basically overrides the desire for rebellion.
That's what the text outlines, yes.
And that unification, according to the timeline mapped out here, fueled an immediate devastating counterpunch. Because Iran didn't just absorb 900 strikes, mourn their supreme leader, and capitulate.
No, not at all. The dispatch details an instantaneous retaliation. Iran launched hundreds of ballistic missiles and thousands of unmanned drones.
Thousands, within hours of a decapitation strike.
Literally within hours, yeah.
See, that completely validates the theory of the decentralized swarm we talked about. The supreme leader is dead, the IRGC high command is in ruins, yet the regional launch commanders had the authority, the communication lines, and the hardware to execute a massive, coordinated response.
And the geographical scope of their targeting is what's truly alarming in the source's account. Iran didn't just fire back at the aircraft that dropped the bombs. They targeted Israeli urban centers.
Wow.
The blog names Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Jerusalem, noting significant civilian casualties and structural damage there. But they also instantly widened the map, targeting U.S. military installations across the Persian Gulf.
Specifically, I think the text mentioned the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, right?
Yes, Qatar and the 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain.
Which means the theater of war just ballooned across the entire Middle East. It's no longer a localized strike on Iran. The text explicitly says the regional spillover hit the airspace and infrastructure of the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Bahrain.
It just engulfed the whole region.
And this is where the proxy network, the axis of resistance, activates. Hezbollah begins firing from Lebanon in the north. The Houthi rebels join the fray from Yemen in the south.
Right.
We see the initiation of sophisticated cyber attacks and physical strikes on commercial shipping near the Strait of Hormuz. And tragically, the dispatch notes this is the phase where the first U.S. military casualties occur, with troops killed in Kuwait and the broader Gulf region.
The author is meticulously illustrating the architecture of asymmetric proxy warfare here. Iran knows it cannot defeat the combined air superiority of the United States and Israel in a conventional head-to-head battle.
Obviously not.
So, their strategy relies on overwhelming the defense systems. By activating Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen, and by utilizing swarms of cheap drones mixed with high-velocity ballistic missiles, they force the U.S. and Israel to defend a geographically massive area.
It's a math problem, basically. If a Patriot missile battery only has so many interceptors and you fire 3 times that number of cheap drones at it from 4 different countries, something is going to get through. They stretch the defense lines till they snap.
And they snap fast.
But while this massive military theater is expanding and raging across the region, the political power vacuum back in Tehran is closing incredibly fast.
Shockingly fast, according to the dispatch. Barely a week after the initial decapitation strike by March 8th, a new supreme leader is already elected.
Just a week later.
Yeah. After a very brief transition managed by an interim council, Mujtaba Khamenei assumes total control.
And the author provides 2 vital pieces of context about Mujtaba Khamenei. First, he is the late supreme leader's son.
Right.
Second, he is widely recognized as a hardliner, like so much so that he was already under U.S. sanctions prior to the war even starting.
Yeah, he was already on the radar.
And his very first public action, according to the blog, is to pledge absolute continuity and brutal revenge.
The blog leans on analysts like Shibli Talhami to make a profound point here. They argue that the unprecedented military pressure didn't fracture the regime. It forcibly hardened it.
So it backfired politically.
According to the source, yes, the external threat eliminated any remaining moderate voices and solidified power exclusively in the hands of the most extreme elements of the IRGC and the clergy.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. I want to explore that metaphor, the grease fire I mentioned earlier, because it fits so perfectly with what the text is describing.
The water on a grease fire.
Yeah, think about the U.S. strategy. They saw a fire, the Iranian nuclear threat and the proxy network, and they threw a massive bucket of water on it with Operation Epic Fury.
Right.
But if you throw water on a grease fire, the water instantly vaporizes, expands, and violently scatters the burning oil everywhere. The kinetic action intended to extinguish the threat actually caused it to spread across 4 different countries and solidify its core under an even more aggressive, younger leader.
The data from the blog suggests exactly that kind of violent unintended expansion. The original maximalist goals of the U.S. denuclearization and regime change are not only unmet, they are further away than ever.
Right.
And the text introduces a chilling new variable regarding this hardened leadership.
Oh, the fatwa.
Precisely. To give our listeners the context, a fatwa is a binding legal ruling or decree in Islamic law issued by a recognized religious authority.
Okay.
The late Supreme Leader had previously issued a fatwa strictly forbidding the development and use of nuclear weapons, framing them as fundamentally un-Islamic. This theological decree acted as a massive internal barrier to their nuclear program.
But the blog claims that analysts believe Mujtaba Khamenei's ascension could signal the complete abandonment of that fatwa.
Exactly. Without the late Supreme Leader to enforce it, and facing an existential military threat from the West, the theological barrier vanishes. The text implies that Iran, under this new hardline leadership, will view a fully realized nuclear weapon as their only absolute deterrent against future decapitation strikes.
Wow. That is the ultimate tragic irony mapped out in this dispatch.
It really is.
The massive military operation specifically designed to permanently prevent a nuclear Iran might be the exact catalyst that removes the final theological roadblock, accelerating their race to actually build a bomb.
Right.
And internally, the author makes it clear that the regime proved ruthless and resilient. The pro-regime rallies, fueled by the mourning we discussed over the school bombing, vastly outweighed any pockets of domestic uprising.
The author notes the regime utilized its internal security forces to swiftly repress any dissent while mobilizing its base. With their political power secured at home, the nature of the conflict fundamentally changes.
How so?
The text outlines a transition away from the initial shock and awe decapitation phase into what it describes as a grinding, deeply punitive campaign of attrition.
Yeah, we move into weeks 2 through 6 of the timeline here, spanning from early March deep into early April. And the author describes near daily airstrikes from the U.S. and Israel.
Every single day.
But the target list undergoes a major shift. They aren't just hunting missile silos anymore. The blog says they systematically begin destroying critical national infrastructure.
Right.
They target major oil and gas facilities, specifically naming South Pars and Karg Island. They destroy power grids, civilian bridges, and massive petrochemical hubs. They also strike the Isfahan facility and manage to knock the IR-40 nuclear reactor completely offline.
Concurrently, the military engagements become much more direct and severe. The text details that the U.S. Navy sinks an Iranian warship, the IRGC Navy chief is killed in a targeted strike, and there are persistent rumors of Israeli ground forces conducting cross-border operations.
So it's escalating on all fronts.
Exactly. And the northern front between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon escalates to a peak intensity.
The human toll the author tallies by early April is just staggering. Thousands dead inside Iran, spanning both military personnel and civilians. Dozens killed in Israel and across the Gulf states.
And U.S. casualties, too.
Yeah, U.S. and coalition military fatalities reach into the low dozens. And millions of civilians are displaced from their homes, primarily in southern Lebanon.
It's a massive humanitarian crisis.
But looking at this shift in targeting from the U.S. and Israel, I have to ask you, why destroy civilian bridges? Why systematically obliterate petrochemical hubs and commercial power plants?
Yo.
Based on the logic of this dispatch, this doesn't look like an attempt to win a battlefield victory.
No, it doesn't.
This looks like a deliberate strategy to systematically bankrupt a nation-state.
It is the definition of total economic warfare. When the source highlights the targeting of South Pars, which is a massive natural gas field, and Karg Island, which is the primary export terminal for Iranian oil, it is outlining a strategy to sever the economic arteries of the regime.
Cut off the money.
Precisely. If you cannot stop the decentralized swarm militarily, you try to starve it financially.
Yeah.
The logic is that destroying their export capacity dries up the revenue stream that pays the IRGC, funds the ballistic missile assembly lines, and subsidizes Hezbollah and the Houthis. You degrade their sheer financial capacity to sustain the war effort.
But economic warfare, as the blog brutally illustrates, is a two-way street.
Oh, absolutely.
Because while the United States is dropping ordnance on Iranian oil terminals, Iran physically controls the most critical valve of the entire global energy economy.
We are talking about the Strait of Hormuz.
Right. The dispatch states that early in the conflict, Iran acts on its ultimate leverage and heavily restricts or outright closes the Strait of Hormuz.
And the mechanisms they use to do this, according to the author, are highly aggressive.
They aren't just putting up a stop sign.
No. They are actively attacking commercial oil tankers, they are imposing arbitrary tolls and boarding permits, and most critically, they begin laying sea mines in the international shipping lanes.
And the logistical paralysis is instantaneous. The source notes that over 150 massive commercial vessels are immediately stalled, terrified to traverse the strait.
And the blog provides a foundational statistic to understand the gravity of this. The Strait of Hormuz is the choke point for roughly 20% of the world's entire oil and liquefied natural gas supply.
I want to speak directly to you, the listener, for a moment, because when we talk about a war in the Persian Gulf or strikes on Karg Island, it can feel incredibly abstract.
It feels very far away.
It feels like lines on a map thousands of miles away from your daily life. But the author of this dispatch draws a straight, unavoidable line from the sea mines in the Strait of Hormuz directly to your bank account.
Yeah, it hits home immediately.
Like, how do sea mines physically stop shipping? It's not just the fear of sinking, it's insurance.
Right, the financial side of it.
Exactly. The moment a mine is detected, maritime insurance premiums from places like Lloyd's of London skyrocket to levels that make shipping economically impossible. The shipping conglomerates refuse to send their vessels. The supply chain freezes instantly.
And the text notes the immediate result. Global oil prices spike by $25 a barrel almost overnight.
The ripple effects described by the source are immense. Asia, which is heavily reliant on Gulf energy, begins facing immediate fuel shortages. The sudden artificial scarcity triggers massive shipping chaos globally, which injects a severe spike of inflation into an already fragile global economy.
Exactly. So that conflict in the Middle East is suddenly showing up in the price of your groceries, the cost of the goods you order online, and the excruciating price you pay every time you fill up your gas tank.
It's all connected.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the concept the author is illustrating here is essentially mutually assured economic destruction. Both sides are trying to bleed the other dry.
The numbers the blog provides are catastrophic. It estimates Iran is losing roughly $435 million every single day in oil revenue because of their own restrictions and the damage to their facilities.
That's massive.
But the West and the global economy is absorbing crippling inflation. The Gulf states, whose entire economies rely on the safe transit of vessels through Hormuz, take a massive, destabilizing financial hit.
And it is precisely this severe domestic economic pain in the United States, compounded by the visceral public reaction to the civilian casualties and the sheer scale of the conflict, that the author claims triggers a historic, unprecedented political explosion back in America.
Right.
While the military is locked in a grinding war of attrition in the Gulf, the political ground beneath the administration completely fractures.
Yeah, the timeline points to March 28th as a massive domestic turning point. The dispatch describes the eruption of what it calls the No Kings protests.
The scale of which is just hard to fathom.
It is difficult to even visualize. We are talking about millions of Americans pouring into the streets across more than 3,000 separate, coordinated events.
3,000 events.
Yes. The blog explicitly categorizes this as the largest single-day protest event in the history of the United States.
The scale is staggering, but the amalgamation of the protesters' grievances is what makes this section of the text so complex.
What do you mean?
Well, the primary catalyst, naturally, is opposition to what the demonstrators are calling an illegal war. This likely ties back to that contentious interpretation of preemptive self-defense under Article 51 that we discussed.
Right. But the author makes a massive leap here. The text explicitly states that these millions of people aren't just protesting the war, they are simultaneously protesting the president's domestic policies, specifically highlighting immigration and what the demonstrators perceive as authoritarian rule.
Yeah, it's a massive fusion of issues.
I have to stop and really challenge the logic of the dispatch here. How does a foreign war against Iran become the ultimate catalyst for a sweeping domestic movement about immigration policy?
It seems disconnected.
It does. How do you fuse deeply complex, separate domestic anxieties into a single mega protest against a foreign conflict?
It's a profound question about political sociology that the source attempts to navigate. The author suggests that the war acted as a massive pressure cooker that finally blew the valve on deep-seated domestic grievances.
Okay.
The unifying theme is the fear of executive overreach.
So the war is just the most extreme symptom of a larger disease they perceive.
According to the logic of the protesters in the text, yes. If a president has the unilateral executive authority to launch 900 strikes, trigger global economic chaos, and fundamentally alter the world order without explicit prior congressional authorization, then that same executive authority is viewed as a domestic threat.
Ah,
The name No Kings implies a rejection of absolute power. For these demonstrators, the unchecked power used to bomb foreign infrastructure is inextricably linked to the unchecked power they fear will be used to enforce hardline immigration policies or curtail civil liberties at home.
so the foreign policy becomes the ultimate, undeniable proxy for their domestic anxiety.
Exactly.
And this raises a fascinating point about grand military strategy that I think gets overlooked. Unprecedented domestic unrest of this magnitude fundamentally degrades a president's ability to wage a foreign war.
Oh, completely.
You cannot sustain a grinding, incredibly expensive, highly lethal blockade in the Persian Gulf if millions of your own citizens are shutting down your major cities and your domestic economy is buckling under inflation.
Right. The optics alone are terrible.
It's like trying to fight a raging fire in your neighbor's house while your own kitchen is actively burning to the ground. You lose all your political maneuverability.
You really do.
And while the United States is consumed by this massive internal fracturing, the dispatch points out that two other global superpowers are quietly standing in the shadows, perfectly positioned to capitalize on the chaos.
The source dedicates significant analysis to the geopolitical maneuvers of Russia and China during this 50-day window.
Yeah.
On the public stage, their diplomatic stance is unified and predictable. The text notes that both nations vehemently condemned the initial strikes, labeling them blatant breaches of the UN Charter and gross violations of Iranian sovereignty.
The blog specifically highlights that Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi heavily coordinated their public messaging.
Right.
They basically dominate the UN Security Council, pushing for immediate ceasefires and urging a return to dialogue, painting themselves as the reasonable peacemakers.
However, the author details a highly sophisticated, entirely different reality operating behind the scenes.
Of course they do.
The text claims that both Beijing and Moscow are actively, materially aiding Iran's war effort without ever officially entering the combat theater.
How are they doing that?
They are engaging in massive intelligence sharing, providing advanced drone technology, and critically, supplying real-time satellite imagery to the Iranian military.
The dispatch also specifically notes that China is supplying what are called dual-use goods and potentially advanced radar systems.
Yeah, that term is important.
We need to define dual-use goods for you, the listener. These are items like highly advanced microchips, carbon fiber materials, or navigation sensors that are ostensibly sold for civilian manufacturing, like building commercial vehicles or telecommunications equipment.
Right, totally illegal to sell.
Exactly. But they can be instantly repurposed and slapped into the guidance system of a kamikaze drone.
Yo.
Wait, looking at how the author describes this dynamic, China and Russia aren't sending a single troop. They are just sending radar and telemetry data.
Not one soldier.
It's exactly like they are a pair of rival casino owners.
How so?
They aren't sitting at the poker table, they aren't betting their own money or risking their own soldiers' lives in the fight, but they are supplying the chips, they are standing behind the U.S. player, and signaling their hand to Iran via satellite imagery, and they are taking a massive cut of the profits while the U.S. and Iran systematically bankrupt themselves.
That analogy perfectly captures the multipolar shadow game the source is describing. The geopolitical leverage they gain is immense, and the mechanism of how they do it is fascinating.
It's really insidious.
Take the satellite imagery the text mentions. By sharing real-time, high-resolution satellite telemetry, Russia and China fundamentally alter the lethality of Iran's response.
Because they can see everything.
Exactly. They aren't just giving Iran a map. They're showing the IRGC the exact locations, rotation schedules, and blind spots of the U.S. Patriot missile batteries and naval destroyers in the Gulf.
Wow.
They allow the Iranian drone swarms to thread the needle through degraded air defenses, maximizing U.S. casualties without a single Russian or Chinese soldier ever firing a weapon.
And the economic windfall for them is wildly asymmetrical. The text explicitly points out that analysts view Russia as the undisputed winner in this scenario.
Right.
Why? Because Russia is a massive oil exporter. When the Strait of Hormuz is mined and the global price of oil violently spikes by $25 a barrel, billions of dollars in unexpected revenue flood directly into Moscow's war chest, funded entirely by the chaos in the Gulf.
The author portrays China's position as slightly more complex, though. They describe it as a mixed outcome.
Okay, why mixed?
Well, strategically, China gains immense leverage by watching the United States bog itself down, deplete its munitions, and fracture its domestic political consensus in another Middle Eastern quagmire.
Right, that benefits them globally.
However, because the Chinese economy requires massive amounts of imported energy from the Gulf to function, they also absorb severe economic damage from the supply chain disruptions and the sheer cost of fuel.
Ah, so they feel the economic pain, too.
Yes, but the text repeatedly emphasizes the core truth. Neither Beijing nor Moscow has committed a single troop to the meat grinder.
So, if we look at the board, according to this dispatch, you have unsustainable, bleeding economic losses on both sides. You have profound and paralyzing domestic protests inside the United States.
Right.
You have a regional proxy war spiraling out of control, and rival superpowers actively fueling the fire. The pressure cooker finally hits its critical limit, and according to the blog, that unbearable pressure forces both sides to the negotiating table.
And that results in an incredibly tense, deeply fragile pause in the violence.
The dispatch outlines that on April 7th and 8th, President Trump announces a 2-week U.S.-Iran ceasefire.
Yes.
Notably, the text specifies that the ceasefire includes Israel's operations against Iran, but deliberately excludes the active combat theater against Hezbollah in Lebanon.
The author notes that the government of Pakistan stepped in to act as the mediator, with high-level talks taking place in Islamabad.
Okay.
But the moment you look at the actual terms of the ceasefire that the blog lays out, it becomes painfully obvious why it was doomed to fail from the start.
Yeah, the terms are completely opposed.
The diplomatic frameworks presented by the U.S. and Iran share exactly one superficial overlap: a temporary halt to direct military hostilities. Beyond that, the demands are fundamentally, structurally incompatible.
Let's break down those demands.
The author states the U.S. insists that Iran immediately clear the mines and reopen the Strait of Hormuz to guarantee the safe passage of commercial maritime traffic.
Which is pretty standard.
But the sticking point is the nuclear demand. The U.S. requires the complete removal of all highly enriched uranium, or HEU, from Iranian soil, and demands a permanent, verifiable ban on any future nuclear enrichment.
Which, if we remember the shift in power to the hardline Mojtaba Khamenei and the suspected lifting of the religious fatwa we talked about earlier, that is a demand Iran will literally never accept.
Never.
The source says Iran's counterproposal only offers a temporary 5-year pause on their nuclear program. And their demands are staggering. They're demanding massive financial reparations from the United States for the destruction of their infrastructure, total sanctions relief, and ironclad security guarantees against future decapitation strikes.
The gap between demanding the total surrender of a nuclear program and demanding reparations for a bombed country is unbridgeable.
Yeah, there's zero middle ground there.
Consequently, the text states that the ceasefire was riddled with massive violations almost immediately.
Surprise, surprise.
Israel heavily bombarded Hezbollah positions in Lebanon, resulting in hundreds of casualties, which instantly triggered retaliatory strikes from Iran and Hezbollah.
Right.
And the author notes a massive escalation around April 12th when the U.S. military imposed a hard naval blockade on all major Iranian ports.
And the situation in the Strait of Hormuz devolves into absolute absurdity.
It really does.
The blog details that on April 17th, Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi publicly claims that the strait is completely open for commercial ships to pass along coordinated, safe routes.
Right.
But within 24 hours, by April 18th, Iran violently reverses that position. They cite the U.S. naval blockade on their ports as an act of international piracy and reinstate the threat.
Just flip-flops entirely.
The text reports live gunfire on merchant vessels and confirms that the sea mines remain an active, lethal threat in the water. So what does this all mean? If you look at the mechanisms of this, you can't have a ceasefire while one side is actively starving the other's ports with a naval blockade, and the other side is holding 20% of the global economy hostage with sea mines.
No, it's not a ceasefire.
Based on the logic of this text, this isn't diplomacy. It's just a strategic pause for both sides to reload their weapons while furiously pointing fingers at each other for the cameras.
The author's analysis aligns perfectly with that conclusion. It is a cynical chance to resupply, masked as a genuine peace process.
Right.
The fundamental geopolitical demands are insurmountable without one side making massive, humiliating concessions. And the domestic politics in both Washington and Tehran currently make that impossible. The U.S. demands absolute denuclearization. Iran demands absolute sovereignty and financial compensation. There is simply no middle ground described in the text.
Which brings us to the exact date of this dispatch. Today, April 19th, 2026.
The author provides a very stark, highly volatile projection of where the world stands at this exact moment. The fragile, 2-week ceasefire is scheduled to officially expire in roughly 3 days, around April 22nd.
3 days.
The source categorizes the immediate future with high uncertainty.
Regarding the global economic chokehold, the text asserts that the Strait of Hormuz will likely only reopen fully and safely if a comprehensive, permanent deal is reached.
Which we just established is highly unlikely.
Right. The U.S. is absolutely insisting on the international right to freedom of navigation, while Iran is violently insisting on its sovereign control over the waters. And the political rhetoric from leadership hasn't cooled down at all.
Not even a little bit.
The blog specifically notes that President Trump has publicly threatened to bomb Iran back into the Stone Ages if a diplomatic deal is not reached by the deadline.
Consequently, the author concludes that a massive resumption of high-intensity fighting is highly likely if there is no miraculous diplomatic breakthrough in Islamabad. Furthermore, the text explicitly throws cold water on the initial premise of the war. It states that a mass civilian uprising capable of toppling the regime remains a low-probability event.
So the regime isn't falling?
No. The hardliners, when consolidated under Mojtaba Khamenei and the remnants of the IRGC, maintain absolute, ruthless internal control.
So if we synthesize everything this staggering Barackface dispatch has laid out for us, 50 days in, the initial decapitation strike successfully killed the supreme leader. But in doing so, it triggered a massive, decentralized, multi-front regional war.
Right.
The United States has faced the largest, most disruptive domestic protests in its entire history. Global shipping is paralyzed, energy prices have spiked, causing crippling inflation, and the original maximalist goals of complete denuclearization and internal regime change remain entirely unfulfilled.
The final analysis provided by the author is a grim ledger. The war severely degraded Iran's conventional military and damaged its nuclear infrastructure, but politically, it hardened Tehran into a more extreme, unforgiving posture.
Yeah, that grease fire effect.
Exactly. It spiked global energy risks to unprecedented levels. And geopolitically, it handed massive strategic and financial leverage to Russia and China, without them having to fire a single shot.
Right.
Diplomacy is cited as the only viable off-ramp to prevent further catastrophe. But the text makes it painfully clear that due to shattered trust, profound domestic political instability in the U.S., and hardline entrenchment in Iran, a total collapse of the peace talks is just as plausible as an extension.
It essentially all hinges on the next 1 to 2 weeks. It's a brutal waiting game to see whether the crushing economic pain of inflation and blockades forces someone to blink and make concessions, or if the hardliners on both sides decide to dig their heels in and escalate further.
It's a very tense moment.
I really want to thank you for breaking down this incredibly dense, volatile timeline with me. Parsing a source document like this, looking at the specific mechanisms, challenging the claims, and understanding the internal logic of the geopolitical dominoes is absolutely crucial for cutting through the noise and the panic when a massive conflict dominates the headlines.
It is essential work. You have to understand the narrative architecture of these events, step by painful step, to really comprehend the broader reality they represent.
And to you, the listener, as you digest everything this specific dispatch has claimed about the violent, chaotic events of the last 50 days, I want to leave you with a lingering thought to ponder. We started this deep dive talking about precision, about wanting to see a clear cause and a clean effect in a messy world. But looking at the sheer terrifying scale of the fallout described in this text, from the sea mines in the Strait of Hormuz, to the millions protesting in the streets of America, to the silent, profitable shadow games played by Beijing and Moscow, it forces us to ask a fundamental question about the future.
Right.
In our hyper-connected, deeply intertwined modern global economy, can a contained regional war ever truly exist anymore? Or does the domino effect of maritime shipping choke points, instantaneous cyber warfare, and superpower proxy support mean that every local conflict is now inherently and inescapably a global war from the very first day?
It's a heavy question.
It's something to think about the next time you hear a politician promise a swift, clean resolution to a complex problem. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.